We're good
All
to
right.
go.
So now we're delighted to hear Alexandre Bayen. So Alexandre Bayen is the Liachow Professor of Engineering at UC Berkeley. He's the director of Berkeley's Institute for Transportation Studies, as well as the director of Aerospace Program Development. And he is also a distinguished researcher who received many prizes, including the Presidential Ali Carrier Award for Scientists and Engineers from the White House and the NASA Top 10 Innovator. So today he will talk about learning policies for microsimulations. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amaury, for the introduction, and thank you, Benedetto, for the organization of the workshop. And thank you to all our European friends who are meeting on a pretty late schedule based on European time. I hope you have a glass of wine, which hopefully will make these talks much more bearable. And share my screen now. Do you see my screen? Okay, perfect. Great. So most of what I'm going to present is the work of others, so I feel particularly fraudulent presenting this today, but I will do it in a spirit of trying to give a bit of an overview of what Circle is, and at the same time not steal the thunder of others coming next, in particular Dan, who is the next talk, and then on the second day. Along that token, I also want to apologize. I will be airborne most of tomorrow, so I look forward to watching the talks recordings, but I won't be live. So for me, this adventure started maybe 6 years ago when I became an adjunct researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And essentially what had become my focus at the time was the energy part of transportation, when before it was the congestion part. Obviously, they're very related, but they're different. And at the time, the Deputy Secretary of Energy, Ruben Sarkar, was presenting this graph based on McKinsey's work at UW and co-workers, in which what he was showing is that if you're not careful with essentially what you do with automation, you could end up really making things worse for people going real fast at really unplatooned configurations, or freeways packed with zero occupancy vehicles just sending their vehicles to pick their children at school, or do things much better. And that was the motivation of what later became energy-based work, and ultimately led to the first DOE-funded Circles project. And so in the specific context of what we do at Berkeley, we like to think of different scales of modeling. I would say about 10 years ago, when I was getting involved in this work, it was a transition in which suddenly there was enough data and computational power to make microsimulation meaningful, in comparison to maybe the previous era where microsimulation had always kind of raised a lot of suspicions: how you calibrate it, can you really run it, is it scalable? And that was the motivation for the vision that Kathy Wu, when she was a PhD student at Berkeley, essentially started as part of her PhD. And most of what I'm presenting today is really an outgrowth of what she did when she was a student, and including the vision. And so the idea is that in microsim, and most of the people in this audience know microsim, you have the ability to model the vehicle class, the vehicle dynamics, a lot of the different attributes of the vehicle, its precise trajectory, and the sky is the limit, that you can always add more to microsimulations. There are different platforms for it, open source like Sumo, or closed commercial like IMSUN and PTV. And so when Kathy was working on this as part of her PhD, and essentially she was trying to figure out how these capabilities could be interfaced with the state-of-the-art reinforcement learning that were just coming out of the lab. So when we identified the topics that were interesting, there were things that were pretty standard, or maybe not so much of interest, and things which were like the challenge. And the challenge is the red here. And the idea is that you really want to solve the problems where it hurts. And at the time where it hurt was essentially the computational burden of running reinforcement learning libraries on microsim, just because of the iterative nature of these processes. So at that time, we had some form of a call of action. You can see I'm a Star Wars fanatic here. And the idea was that we wanted to demonstrate that you could interface a microsim, so say Sumo, for example, with RLib and RLab and whatever reinforcement learning libraries were available at the time, and run this on the cloud. And again, place yourself 10 years ago, none of the microsims were running on the cloud. In fact, this project was the first project for which IMSUN ran on the cloud based on the 210. So there was a bit of a historical turn of events when that became a possibility. Now, I'm going to just do a deep dive in the history of traffic, just to kind of maybe explain the motivation here. Most of you are familiar with Bruce Greenshields, credited as one of the fathers of traffic flow modeling theory, and that he was probably historically the first person to measure traffic jam in a funnel diagram in 1935. Most of you are also probably familiar with this movie that was a screenshot of Sugiyama's ring experiment, in which drivers were asked to drive at a constant speed and keep their distances. And for those of you who know this movie, you know that after a few seconds, like literally 30 seconds, traffic instabilities start to form. These have been quite often studied. Benny Siebold at Temple and many MIT people wrote very early on this topic. This is known to be one of the major causes of energy inefficiency in traffic, for no reasons, because it's still a constant demand, but the point is humans are not good at regulating these processes. So fast forward 10 years, and many of our co-organizers of this workshop and Circle members did this pioneering and truly transformational experiment, in which the insertion of that single self-driving vehicle into that ring, which I'm showing here, currently operated by a human, when turned on, managed to smooth traffic oscillations, which it's doing now. By now, this movie is also a classic, so I make the assumptions that many have seen it. But I think the truly transformational aspect of it is that this was probably historically the first demonstration that flow smoothing can work, and that you don't need a crazy penetration to achieve the results. The results at the time, as were presented to us, were absolutely spectacular. 42% of energy reduction, not even modeled, but directly from the readings, was spectacular. Even people at Berkeley debated that this could be done. And even when confronted with the data, were not convinced, given how brilliant the results were. And so the interesting part of the story for us starts 1 year later, when Kathy try to recreate that same experiment in simulation. And so what you see here now is the Sumo interface that was used to demonstrate the same results in simulation, where the red car is the automated vehicle, the blue car is the only car it can sense, and the white car is doing whatever it's doing, which could be an IDM, could be a CFM, could be your favorite model. And you can see that the traffic oscillations are smooth. And so I always do this as a bit of a trap slide, in that people will ask you, well, why are you showing a 2018 simulation when there was an experiment in 2017? And that's mainly to highlight the fact that this simulation was done in a way that the algorithm, even though it was using an underlying model in the reinforcement learning loop to compute the score, was essentially not aware of the model of the dynamics of the other vehicles. And that's a paradigm shift, in that I think part of the classical approach that even I followed when I was a student and early in my academic career is to consider model-based approaches, in which you model the physics, and based on that, you try to achieve a certain optimal goal. This is different, in that you do not make the assumption that you know the physics. You can only assume in that paradigm that you can measure the score, and that you have the ability to simulate the physics without the expert knowledge. So what was striking is that this approach mapped, in a sense, the performance of the experiment. Granted, it's only in simulation, but without the use of the physics model. And that's also interesting in terms of paradigm shift, because when you look at what reinforcement learning has enabled over the last decade, many model-based fields find themselves leapfrogged by this approach, which also has its limitation. I mean, at some point, people need to talk about safety and other things. But it certainly made a lot of people perplexed in the field of transportation, because it kind of opened a new door for a lot of different contributions. And so for us, it was really the beginning of an era in which we were trying to see how this could be generalized. And so the later part of Kathy's thesis, which I'm also going to present here, try to see how this approach could be generalized. And really, to give credit where it's due, the early team of that project, and Eugene Vinitsky and Woody Kreidier, and Kathy Jiang, who was an undergrad at the time, and several others, really built that vision on which our work is based today. So the next movies I'm showing is all use the same type of color coding, in which the red cars are the self-driving vehicles. The only sense thing they can do are the blue cars, and then they cannot sense the white cars other than their effect on the system. And so part of that work led to interesting generalizations. For example, the stabilization of a double ring by obnoxious behavior discovered by the controller, where you essentially prevent the people behind from passing you. There's a very good ingredient to create road rage. That is also taught in police academies. So these are commonly referred to as snail operations in France. For an obvious reason, it's that you slow the traffic behind you. So an interesting case of emergent behavior rediscovered by the algorithms. This was pushed further in this 8-figure case where if you don't do anything to an intersection, essentially the politeness approach leads to the most inefficient way of handling that intersection, which is everybody stops. So it's bad for throughput and it's bad for energy. And the solution discovered by the algorithm for that case, if you kind of rationalize it post facto, shows that the red car chooses the proper speed to achieve the optimal length of the snake so that it exactly manages to maximize the throughput right when the intersection becomes free. Obviously, that's a rationalization that is good for writing books, but it's not, I mean, the RL just figured it out from the scoring. And you could also view this as a rediscovery of platooning. If you like time-space diagrams, essentially it's kind of learned to do platoons and it's a more efficient way, less deceleration and acceleration and more throughput. This was generalized further, and there's a bunch of scenarios that we usually like to show that come from that era a few years ago when Flow Team 1 was doing this. So this is an example of an intersection, which if you try to maximize the throughput or use some proxy in the form of the scoring function, it's kind of hard now to figure out what it's doing. You can see it's kind of playing the role of a traffic light by stopping cars. At some point, it's releasing the queue. But you can see that now it's an interesting case where if you had model-based approaches, it's not clear you'd be able to come up with an obvious analytical solution, but somehow the RL figures out a way to push the efficiency of that intersection further. And so at that point, Aboudi and Eugene were getting into the group and more involved in this. And so part of the things we were trying to experiment and play with are transfer learning problems where you learn in a setting and you deploy in a different setting. So what if you could learn from the ring, it's a bigger ring, and see if that could apply to a merge like this. So merge are known to create traffic waves propagating backwards if you perturb them. This is done here by the merge situation, which creates some local backlog, which then back propagates. I don't know how well that translates over Zoom, but if you can see the movie, essentially you should see these waves going backwards. And this is one of the possible sources of these waves. And so now if you do apply the controller that was learned on the ring, what you will see is after a while, the red cars, which can see what's happening with the blue cars, so they do have downstream information, at some point learn to slow down in time so that they can reconnect with the stream of traffic when the wave is dissipated. You can see it stopped for a little bit and now it's kind of reaccelerating and then rejoining the flow here. So you could, argue in an elevator conversation style that you've essentially taught a self-driving vehicle to become a traffic light in the name of greater energy efficiency. So, and it's exactly what it's doing. I mean, if you look at the time-space diagrams, every time you insert a new vehicle, it creates this back propagating wave. So that's where the energy and efficiency comes from. But then if it has knowledge of that slowdown, because of what it learned on the ring, it preventively decreases its speed to reconnect with that stream when that stream has essentially cleared. So you could view this as a form of a variable speed limit or traffic light, but that behavior learned from the ring. And so at that time, the work of Eugene and Aboudi was picked by Science Magazine and a few TV channels. And that was really when we were getting in shape for circles, because at that point, we became convinced that with a certain penetration of AVs, you could really start to see energy efficiency improvements in traffic. So not changing congestion, not changing VMT or TTT drastically, but just improving the energy of the flow drastically. And so our prime target, after many conversations with Benny Siebold and Dan Work and John Sprinkle and Benedetto Piccoli and a few others, we were convinced that a good target for this was essentially the stop and go waves that we see here. The experience in Arizona, in particular, the controller that Maria Laura de la Monache had implemented was greatly inspirational. And so we decided to now built a program here with the 5 campuses where we would push this to the field and not doing it in a contained scenario environment like a parking lot, but really on the freeway, which creates a lot more difficulties. And so initially we were trying to leverage the very precise modeling work that was done at Berkeley by the Connected Corridors team. The team had spent 3 years building a micro simulation model that is fully calibrated, and we thought that might be a possible deployment site. Also because you could learn through that model, and we did not want to be in the business of building such models. That was very good to develop our algorithms. It turned out to not be a great site for a variety of reasons, but that's how our Gen 1 algorithms started to work. For example, this one, which was put together by Aboudi Kraidier, shows the efficiency of the controllers in mixed autonomy traffic. So right now what you see is a blown up square that shows one of the congestion choke points of the 210. You might be able to see where my mouse is hovering. There is essentially backward propagating wave that will progressively clog that rectangle. And in about 15 seconds, you're going to see blue cars appearing. And when that happens, that means essentially the red cars have turned on their controllers and are going to start smoothing the traffic. At that point, the travel time and the VMT doesn't change drastically, but the waves will be removed, which is kind of the objective of the controllers. And so what's interesting here is that essentially most of the learning is done. You can see now this is happening. So I'm not sure how stroboscopic effects work over Zoom, but essentially on my screen, traffic is much smoother. And so the point here is that that learning at that point only requires a calibrated model, which is what until last year we thought we would push forward in our project. Because essentially the idea is you want to just off-spin the ability of the modeling to the experts and use the model, including the lane change model, in order to learn. It turns out there's better ways to do things. We found out in the last summer in Nashville, but that was a first step towards it. And so with this, our interest is to migrate control policies to the operating systems of the car to smooth traffic. And our concrete objective, it still says 210, but now it's really I-24 in Nashville, Tennessee, is to demonstrate that next year at a bigger scale. We've done some preliminary tests this summer, and Dan Work will probably talk about it next year. And so at that point, really the quest of this group has become, how many cars do we need to smooth traffic? It's a wide question. We have some preliminary results in simulation, but the idea is to try to do it in practice. I'm going to skip this, but just maybe to mention briefly Eugene's work as well. There's other applications of this that we might be interested in the future. And then in particular, if you think about Lagrangian metering and how to hold vehicles to conserve throughput at bottlenecks, this has a lot of applications for bridges. And then there are other things we've done together with Andreas Malikopoulos' group at University of Delaware. You heard the beautiful talk. I would say my favorite part of that testbed is the French restaurant and bakery, because I think that's really what makes that testbed valuable. But beyond these culinary aspects, which are very important, one thing that we also demonstrated with Andreas's group and the work of Kathy was the ability to transfer policies learned in software into hardware. And this was the first time that flow algorithms actually made it into hardware. And in that particular case, what the algorithm achieves is a lesser time of exit of the last vehicle of the stream, this Hummer here, with respect to the uncontrolled scenario, where the control on the right was achieved by the self-driving vehicles that were the blue vehicles you just saw in the movie. We did other hardware implementation following that. At the time when we were just getting ramped up on the hardware, this was work done by Fengyu. You can see Fengyu here and Eugene at the last CPS meeting before the world shut down because of the pandemics in DC. And so here, if you play the movie long enough, you'll see the waves being removed here. Another aspect of this work, which we were also interested at the time and is still open, is the notion of, could we remove the state space and essentially have a model completely pixel-based approach to this? So the idea here is, rather than using traffic scenarios and access to state space, why not use rendering of traffic? And there's ulterior motives here, is that if you could learn from video data only without building the model, you might be able to even get more efficient work there. And Fengyu and Fadwa Alaksar and a few others are still working on this. You need to kind of change the action space in some ways and also have a correction and the reward function. But there's preliminary results that indicate that this approach works quite well. This is Minicity, or University of Delaware's Scaled City network here that we used, and we try to see how these same algorithms we had worked on for the ring and the 8-figure would work here. The interesting part of this is that you could assume that you have centralized information. So say you have a rendering of the full city, or you could assume that you have local information only. For example, just what a car can sense around it and see the difference in it. So this is not something we've pushed entirely yet, and Fengyu's work is still active on this. But this is something that I think has great promise, especially when we're going to see more merge of machine learning and vision and traffic flow modeling. And you can see where that would be going too, because in a sense, at some point, dashboard cameras will be able to collect that information. So you can think about the middle movie that I just showed here as an idealized version of what really every car, maybe in 10 years, will have at least as sensing, maybe not as actuation, but as a minimum as sensing. When we want to make people really upset, we show that RL has essentially killed many fields already, gaming, and for people who were born in the 70s like myself, Pong and iconic games, the game of Go, and really the big target is traffic, and we're really far from being done. So I'm gonna not spend too much time on this. This is also stolen from Kathy's PhD defense, but that's kind of what we do. And I think what was transformational when we did this initially is that this is, to our knowledge, the first time that reinforcement learning, cloud computing, and microsim were essentially integrated in a single platform for these algorithms. And so we did a bunch of Lego block style runs that hopefully today can scale to more complex systems. There's a whole system that you'll hear more about in the workshop, maybe from others, and Johnny Lee, our PM, is one of the key architects there, and that's really important. It's also enabling a lot of benchmarking for us, so try to see how algorithms do when compared to each other. And that's important because we still do a lot of model-based control. Alex Keimer and Yingling Yu, who are on this call as well, are currently working on optimal controllers that we can potentially later use in imitation learning, in a way that we can merge both model-based approach that are more data intense in terms of what they require, and learning algorithm that could maybe get abstracted from that data by learning from the expert controllers. Now, this is a big team, and I want to finish the talk by telling a little bit about what we're doing last summer with not stealing too much thunder. So I make the assumption that Dan will present more in the next talk, and John as well. And in the meantime, John moved, but for the sake of the start of the project, I'm still showing the old map. So this is the I-24 test bed. Again, Dan will probably show a lot more movie. This is the team last summer in Nashville that run our test. We did a lot of different tests and run a pretty large operation with 11 vehicles, 4 of which had controllers embedded in them, with great assistance from the police force, because it's not that easy to actually get platoons of cars on the freeway, especially that freeway. 24 is a little bit crazy. And then we had a command center where people could just watch in real time and then and do the analytics. And Benny was running a lot of the team here that was just being ready to intervene if anything would happen. This is one of the monitoring stations. And so one thing which is interesting, because that's really what we're doing now, is this is our test bed. So it's a pretty long stretch. You can see it takes about 14 minutes to drive it. It does experience a lot of stop and go waves. Traffic is actually quite crazy on that freeway. What you will hear later in the workshop is like a lot of the different setups we have. So the idea is that at least when you're still running this in test mode, and this is the name of the drivers, you have some automated vehicles that can sense vehicles around them that are not our vehicles. These are the white vehicles. And once in a while, one of our vehicle that acts both as a shepherd, but also as a sensing vehicle. And so we had several scenarios with this. Sean was one of the people who came up with these scenarios. It's pretty hard actually to come up with these scenarios in a way that works. And that was kind of one of the first achievements in the summer. We have the ability to look at our data. I strongly encourage you to attend the talk of Eugene Vinitsky after Francesco's talk later this afternoon. He will show you what we found out. It's actually amazing to see the propagation of the savings in the vehicles from one vehicle to another. Some of it is in simulation, some of it is real. He will also be able to explain why. It's complicated to run such tests, but the results we had last summer are extremely encouraging. I'm going to skip this because it's going to be presented this summer. Maybe looking a little bit more in the future is we also have new partnerships now, and it's been really great to work with Toyota, and Ken Butts has been a fantastic contributor to our team, and we're really grateful for their support. We're very excited that Nissan has just come on board this month, and so we're going to run some local tests in California. Most of our vehicles are currently in Nashville, but we're also going to run something locally for the city of Danville as a ramp up to bigger tests next summer. And we're also very excited about the upcoming partnership with GM and hopefully get GM vehicles involved as well. Finally, I think if you're interested in this work, and I see that I'm about 2 minutes from being over time. So we still have the Flow open source library. It's getting harder and harder to maintain over time because Gen 1 is nearly gone and things have moved forward in different ways. We do learning differently, and you'll probably find out a little bit about it from Eugene's talks as well, lane by lane. But we still have that framework open and love to continue it. And it's really a testimony to Kathy Wu's legacy, because she was the one who had the vision for this. And then Eugene and Abudi and Kathy Zhang and Feng Yu and several others really carried it forward afterwards. And if you're interested, for those who are not part of our team here on the call, we're a big consortium. We're going to continue growing. We're excited about Maria Laura's arrival at UC Berkeley. I think it's going to be great to have her here, and hopefully a lot of others at some point will join us as well. I'm going to stop here, but I want to thank Benedetto for organizing this workshop. I want to thank Amaury for running it. Thank you all for being here, and I'd be very happy to take questions, assuming we have time for questions.
Yes, we do. So are there any questions? So, all right, if there's not a question right away, I'm going to give you time by asking you a question. So thank you, Alex. This was very fascinating, at least from my point of view. So you talked a lot about highways and the work that was done this summer. I have a question concerning smaller roads where there would be, for instance, like only 1 or 2 lanes. Does the ability of the AV to work as moving traffic light could completely change the congestion of smaller roads, and including in cities? Like, are we going to see I don't know, police cars being autonomous vehicles regulating traffic inside cities with a control that has been learned by an RL principle in the future?
Yeah, in fact, there is a lot of different work that is done on that topic. Andreas Malikopoulos, I mean, I think part of the mini city that is a testbed at the University of Delaware is a good example of that. And then many people have worked on either V2I, so vehicle to infrastructure interaction, or V2X. And the signal actuation timing is also a paradigm already used in transit in some ways. It's been true in the rail in Germany, and it's been in some ways experimented with. Yeah, so I think I'm not sure that the automation of arterial traffic will necessarily lead to decrease in congestion, but I do believe that it will certainly lead in more efficiency of infrastructure, such as intersection. And ultimately, I think that, but that's probably 20 years from now, when routing merges with control, then it might have a real chance at changing demand. But I think that's a paradigm that is still a bit far, I think.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Okay, so as we're just in time, maybe we can start now with